Greetings to the audience, the participants, and to the Brazil Solidarity Initiative from the city of São Paulo. Unfortunately, I'm unable to participate live today because I'm reporting on location for teleSur, and I have a couple reports I have to do during the time of the stream. Nevertheless, I'd like to give you a brief state of the play of the situation about the Brazilian elections, which are now coming up in only 3 days. Today's Lula's 77th birthday, and this is happening in the midst of one of the biggest political comebacks in modern history. Even if he fails to win the election this Sunday, it's still going to go down in history because he's the first challenger to ever beat an incumbent in a first-round presidential election in Brazil since the return to democracy in 1985. Now, the polls right now show that he's about between 5 to 8 points in the lead. However, the polls underestimated Bolsonaro's performance in the first round. They may be overcompensating for it now and giving him more points than he may end up getting, because there have been a few scandals that have rocked his presidency since the beginning of the second round electoral season, which started on October 3rd, after he polled within 6 million votes of Lula in the first round. Now, 6 million votes is actually a lot of votes. Some of the press was recording it as if it was this huge upset. In actuality, the last time that a US presidential election came down to this amount of votes, proportionately speaking, knowing that the US is about 1/3 larger than Brazil, was the 2008 presidential election when Obama beat McCain. So it wasn't that thin of a margin. However, Bolsonaro outperformed a lot of expectations. Now, there's a couple reasons for that, but one of them comes down to plain money. As the incumbent, Bolsonaro has control of the federal budget. And a study by Reuters Brazil that was released last week shows that he's essentially illegally rerouted around 54 billion US dollars, the equivalent, 273 billion reais, directly to benefit his campaign. He did this in several different ways. One of the things he did was he put a massive tax cut on petroleum and petroleum derivatives. Gas prices were reaching record heights. This mainly because after the 2016 coup against Brazil's first woman president, Dilma Rousseff, on a non-existent charge of a budgetary infraction that was legalized 2 days after she left office, the new government liberalized fuel prices in a nation that at the time was self-sufficient in fuel. Now, Brazil's importing about 20% of its gasoline from the US because since the 2016 coup, they've started closing refineries. At the time of the coup, Brazil was entirely self-sufficient. Nevertheless, as one of the major petroleum-producing nations in the world, there's no reason for Brazil to link its fuel prices to the international markets, which is exactly what Michel Temer did. It's what Jair Bolsonaro refused to undo after taking office, and it's resulted in nearly daily price fluctuations and the highest fuel prices in recent memory. So what he did, instead of disconnecting the fuel prices from international market prices, he simply rerouted money from cancer research, cancer treatment, and cancer prevention from the public health system to compensate for a massive lowering of the fuel taxes. This helped gain support with the middle class, who are now voting more for Bolsonaro than they are for Lula. The only social class in which Lula is leading, and by a very wide margin, are in families that make less than 2 times the minimum wage. All other social classes favor Bolsonaro, or at least favored him in the first round election. Now, the thing that's in Lula's favor on this is that 77% of the population makes less than 2 minimum salaries. So it's almost irrelevant that all of these middle class, lower middle class, middle class, and bourgeois are supporting Bolsonaro, electorally speaking. Other things that Bolsonaro has done in rerouting state funds to help him gain support from the electorate One example that's been constantly used in the Anglo media is that he issued an executive order declaring a state of emergency, that he could bypass congressionally mandated spending limits and increase welfare payments by 50% during the 3 months leading up to the election. A lot of people predicted that this would give the election to Bolsonaro, but all of the research that's been done subsequently shows that it hasn't changed the fact that the poor are voting for Lula by more than 2-to-1 margin over Bolsonaro. Most poor people believe that as soon as the elections are over, this increase in welfare payments will be cut. And in fact, there's no provision for this increase to continue in the 2023 federal budget. In fact, when 2023 happens, there's going to be all kinds of cuts to public services, and they're talking about removing deductibles from income tax for private health care and education, which would hit the middle class hard, just to make up for all of this money that's been rerouted to try and increase Bolsonaro's popularity with the electorate. So when you consider the fact that in dollar terms, I guess I should be using pound terms because it's the UK, but I'm sorry, I haven't been on top of all the happenings with a pound amidst all of the chaos that's going on in Parliament over there. In dollar terms, the Brazilian Workers' Party has spent around $30 million on Lula's campaign. The Bolsonaro campaign has spent around $160 million from campaign funds and private donations. In private donations, they outnumber donations to the Lula campaign by around 40-to-1. Lula's only gotten about $1.5 million in private donations. Plus, when you add the $54 billion of state funds that's been rerouted to help Bolsonaro in the election, you see that he spent hundreds of times more money on his campaign than Lula does. Now, what equalizes the playing field is that Brazil has a relatively unique electoral system in which, because all of the television stations are public concessions, they're required by law to grant free airtime during the election campaign season, which officially begins around 6 weeks before the election date. It's a short season. There's a pre-campaign season before that for a couple months, but the public television ads don't appear during that time. So these blocks of airtime are given out to candidates according to how many seats their political party and party coalition have in Congress, and it's given a slight advantage in airtime to Lula this time around. And they usually come on during prime time, and then once during midday, and then periodically throughout the day. So this is one of the factors that's kept Lula in the running and even in the lead, and also just the base level organizing that's historic from the Workers' Party. The Workers' Party was created by the labor union movement and the social movements like the MST, and so these members of these organizations constitute a base of around 15, if you include the family members, even over 20 million people who are knocking on doors, talking to people at bus stops, talking to their friends in bars and supermarket lines and things like that to try and bring out the vote for Lula. Bolsonaro's main tactic has been defamation and slander through micro-targeting tactics influenced by Cambridge Analytica to specific demographic groups, particularly right-wing Catholics and evangelical Christians who have been bombarded with false information. In 2018, they managed to successfully convince a large part of the electorate that the replacement candidate for Lula, Fernando Haddad, was a pedophile, or that he encouraged pedophilia. He encouraged the sexualization of children. And you see there's almost like a QAnon type element to that. And a lot of people, including me myself, believe that it had to do with this constant contact between the Bolsonaro children, Eduardo especially, and Steve Bannon and Bannon's movement and other right-wing actors connected with the Trump administration, because the tactics appeared very similar, including this Cold War era red baiting of constantly accusing Lula of being essentially a baby-eating communist, just like Trump accused Biden of being a communist, which is absolutely ridiculous. But for now, the electoral courts in August 2021, which have been around for 90 years, the electoral court system, it's tasked with overseeing all elements of the electoral process, including the voting machines, the tallying, and violations of election law and punishment for violations of election law. In August 2021, they ruled that the Bolsonaro campaign had indeed illegally employed the use of social media with illegal corporate funding, and that had helped throw the election, and that they knew it had happened. They didn't have enough courage to undo Bolsonaro's presidency, which they could have just nullified his electoral victory. But instead, in one of the rulings, Alexandre de Moraes, who is now the president of the Superior Electoral Court, said, look, we know exactly how you did it. We're not going to let it happen again. And so for the last month, they've been coming down really hard on this kind of stuff. They recently, after a series of smear ads ran using Willie Horton-style rhetoric. Willie Horton was someone who was used by the Bush campaign in the United States, Bush Sr. in 1988, and it's become a kind of symbol of race baiting and blaming left-of-center politicians for being soft on crime, all rolled up into one. So they ran a series of hate ads falsely claiming that Lula was friends with one of the largest organized crime figures in Brazil, Marcola from the PCC, and also that most prisoners had voted for Lula, which is false because most prisoners in Brazil can't vote, right? Only people on parole can vote. So in a really landmark ruling, the Superior Electoral Court gave Lula 118 additional 30-second slots of free advertising space on all television and radio stations in the country last week. And so it looks like this might be enough to push things over the edge. Meanwhile, for the last year and a half, Bolsonaro, his top allies, including Roberto Jefferson, the former leader of the PTB party, which is one of the larger parties in Congress, and some of the military brass, like General Braga Neto, have been undermining faith in the electronic voting system and undermining faith in the election, and also making spurious attacks against the only branch of government that is still maintaining some kind of distance from the Bolsonaro administration, which is the Supreme Court system. And so there have been repeated cases where allies of Bolsonaro have made threats of violence, threats of assassination against individual Supreme Court members, especially Alexandre de Moraes, who's a political protege of vice presidential candidate Geraldo Alckmin, interestingly enough. And in some cases, these people making these claims have been actually jailed, including some elected officials like Daniel Silveira in Rio de Janeiro. And so there have been a couple scandals that have happened since the beginning of the second round that have prevented Bolsonaro from narrowing the gap, and one of these involves the Superior Electoral Court and the Supreme Court. Roberto Jefferson, last Sunday, who is the whistleblower in what everyone now knows was a sham, weaponized, lawfare-based anti-corruption scandal during Lula's first term in office called the Mensalão. Roberto Jefferson made violent threats against some of the Supreme Court ministers and was put under house arrest. On Sunday, he deliberately provoked the Supreme Court again. He called Supreme Court Justice Carmen Lucia a prostitute, and made some violent threats against the court. And so the Supreme Court considered this a violation of his terms of his house arrest. So they sent a team of federal police to arrest Roberto Jefferson. And some evidence has come out now that this was pre-planned between Jefferson and Bolsonaro. They're very close friends. When the police arrived, Jefferson threw hand grenades at them, opened fire, and hit a policewoman in the head and leg with machine gun fire. Now, luckily it didn't penetrate her skull. She was knocked unconscious briefly, but she's okay. And another police officer was hit with shrapnel. It seems like this was meant to be kind of like a dog whistle to the most extremist far-right supporters of Jair Bolsonaro, that there was a coup kicking off, except that the fact that he hit police officers created an enormous backfiring. It doesn't seem like he was really trying to do that, but now he's facing 4 charges of attempted murder in Bangu prison in Rio de Janeiro, and Bolsonaro was put in this absurd position in which he was forced to either, defend police, which has been one of the key focuses of his entire political career, police rights, or defending one of his closest political allies, Roberto Jefferson, who hired Bolsonaro's son Eduardo as a ghost employee in his congressional cabinet when he was only 18 years old for 10,000 reais a month, for a position in which he didn't have to show up to work. So it's an old friend. He chose stabbing his friend in the back. He condemned the actions of Roberto Jefferson, and he spoke out in defense of the police. So this threw a monkey wrench into that, what appeared to be a possible coup attempt, And so yesterday, Bolsonaro announced that an employee of the Superior Electoral Court system, who had just been forced out, he'd just been fired, had all of this information on illegal amounts of radio airtime in northeastern Brazil granted to Lula, and that he had an audit, and they submitted this claim to the Superior Electoral Court, which was immediately rejected because it wasn't a real audit. They didn't have any actual proof of this happening. And in fact, there's plenty of proof to the contrary that it didn't happen. And so this put Bolsonaro this put the whole campaign into a kind of panic mode. He held a press conference last night, but it only lasted 10 minutes. Sitting next to him was former retired General Augusto Heleno, who's the head of all of Brazil's intelligence agencies. Some might remember him as the director of MINUSTA's military operations in Haiti during the Sitsolé massacre. He's a rabid enemy of Lula. He blames Lula for the fact that he was forced out of Haiti after the massacre, and has hated Lula ever since. He was the only person sitting by Bolsonaro's side. His vice presidential candidate wasn't even with him. And Bolsonaro blasted the electoral courts once again. He's also given out instructions to his armed followers to surround all of the polling stations on Sunday until the votes tallied. So, although there's been these warning signs for the last year and a half that Bolsonaro will not respect the results of the election if he loses, it appears, and I don't know what's happening behind closed doors, but it appears that he's become more and more isolated, even from the military. An internal study from the Defense Department, the Ministry of Defense, that was leaked to the media, leaked to veteran journalist Diane Santos, shows the results of an internal poll among military brass, which shows that although the Navy top brass and the Air Force top brass expressed support for a rupture of democracy led by Bolsonaro in the case that he loses the election, the Army, which is bigger than those two branches combined, does not. Nor do most of Brazil's 26 military police forces. each military police department is controlled at the state level. They're not related to each other. And most surprisingly, the Rio de Janeiro military police, which is Bolsonaro's home base, its political center, is not on board with Bolsonaro trying to break from democracy. On top of that, a large percentage of the bourgeois support Bolsonaro, but another big percentage do not. And as Brian Pitts points out in an article that's coming out on NACLA probably tomorrow, he showed me a draft this morning as I was eating breakfast right before I came on to talk to you guys, and guys and women and everything. A lot of the Brazilian bourgeoisie is not in favor of a return to a kind of dictatorship situation. And we can see that in some of the most important bourgeois actors switching sides and beginning to support Lula at this moment, including the Maggi family, which is the largest agribusiness family in Brazil. Simone Tebet herself, who's from an agribusiness family, she was the third place candidate in the elections. Now she's actively campaigning for Lula. And the São Paulo Federation of Industry, which was a key player in the 2016 parliamentary judicial mediatic coup against Dilma Rousseff, supporting Lula. Now, Lula won them over very easily. He said, look, I'm aware that you guys aren't leftists or progressives or anything, but don't you think it's in your best interest that all these factories stop closing in São Paulo? Because since Bolsonaro took office, Ford's shut down, Mercedes has shut a plant, all the factories are closing. You guys are the Federation of Industry, and it convinced them. So it looks like right now, it's hard to tell with the polls. I don't want to sound overly optimistic, but it looks like these scandals involving the Bolsonaro administration and Bolsonaro himself since October 3rd have prevented him from narrowing the gap with Lula. Lula's campaign seems to be picking up some momentum. It looks like he's going to win on Sunday. And it looks like Bolsonaro is going to begrudgingly accept the results, but at the same time try to motivate all of his far-right supporters, which represent, according to a study that was done by University professor Esther Solano earlier this year, it's only about half of the Bolsonaro supporters that are the real fanatics. He's going to try and motivate them to do some kinds of terrorist activities. There might be some commotion on January 1st, which is the day that the new president takes office, similar to the January 6th event in Washington, D.C., which Jair's son Eduardo participated in the War Council meeting for that on the night of the 5th with Lindell and Sidney Powell and Rudy Giuliani and all those other people. There's probably going to be something like that, but it probably won't be enough to prevent Lula from taking office if he wins. There's a massive increase in political violence underway right now. Unfortunately, there's probably going to be more deaths, but it doesn't look like it's going to be enough to turn the tides and keep Bolsonaro in power. That's my prediction, at least. So in terms of international solidarity, what do we need here in Brazil? And I'm saying this as a Brazilian. You might not know from my accent, but I immigrated to Brazil in 1991. So I consider myself a Brazilian first, a US Brazilian immigrant. What we could really use in terms of international solidarity is quick recognition of the results of the election, because we know Bolsonaro's gonna cry fraud. I know that there's a bill that's going to go to the floor of the House and Senate in the United States, or some kind of resolution. I don't know if it's a bill, saying that the U.S. is going to immediately respect the results of the election. The U.S., which has been involved, which was ironically involved in Lula's political imprisonment, which was part of the US DOJ SEC Curitiba Public Prosecutor's Office Operation Car Wash, which started during the Obama administration. It's ironic, but the Democrats do not want Bolsonaro. It looks like I think US big business wants Bolsonaro to stay in power. All of the petroleum companies, the mining companies, and agribusiness giants like Cargill, which are making billions of dollars off of the exploitation of the Amazon, want Bolsonaro to stay in power. But for a large percentage of the Democratic Party, they don't want Donald Trump's big ally in power for another 4 years. They think it could blow back to the US. So it looks like, it looks like they're announcing this resolution tomorrow, and hopefully it'll be approved. But it would be great if like UK could do something similar, Ireland, European Union, all of these other countries could immediately recognize the results. We know that after the illegitimate impeachment of Dilma Rousseff in 2016, most countries in South America did not recognize that impeachment. But it was the quick action by the US government 3 days after the impeachment, officially recognizing the results of the impeachment through the envoy Joe Biden, who told Michel Temer that he had the full support of the Obama administration when he met with him in Europe. That was an important factor in keeping Michel Temer in power. So we're hoping that something similar can happen now when Lula wins the election, if and when he wins the election. Because when push comes to shove, Jair Bolsonaro is the biggest bootlicker of the United States government in the history of the Brazilian presidency, really, since in modern times, since the return to democracy in 1985. But even like if you compare it to the military dictatorship, even the dictatorship, as sycophantic as they were to the United States, didn't kiss up to it as much as Bolsonaro. So it would be really big if the US and its allies and other countries like China, that's the most important trade partner of Brazil by a long shot right now, could recognize these results and warn the Bolsonaro and his allies, his cabal of neo-fascist allies, not to try and make a rupture with democracy. And so with that, I want to thank you once again for inviting me to talk. I wish I could have participated live, but I've got to go out and hit the streets right now for teleSur. You can watch my coverage on teleSur English and on my Twitter, which is Brian M. teleSur. Okay, thanks again.